So, no, I wouldn't say I have a passion for HR.
Welcome back to Human Resources for the People. It's a human capital revolution. So, we're going to talk about the new EU directive on pay and transparency surrounding pay. It was adopted by the EU Parliament late March of 2023, the EU Council in late April 2023, and then published on the official journal with its effective date 20 days later on June 6th. Now, next up, the EU member states have about 3 years to put this into local law. And so this is kind of a far-reaching and wide-reaching affair. For example, employers have to tell their employees on an annual basis about the right to receive information about from their employer on their pay level and the average pay levels broken down by sex. And so employees who are performing the same work or work of equal value, have the right to ask for this information. Now, I would imagine that this has always, more or less been the right among hourly employees in the EU, just because of how important trade unions are in the European Union. As a result of their power, most of the pay is pretty transparent on the hourly basis. They generally know what each other are making. But in addition, that is not true, of course, up the chain. And then in addition, there is employers with less than 100 employees that are required to publish information on pay as well. In addition, the EU directive gives the governments of the European Union discretion to determine appropriate compensation or reparation for employees who are impacted by the pay gap. I'm curious about that. I mean, I'm curious if it works both ways. If, for example, a male is making less than a female teacher, whether or not they could request compensation. I assume so. I assume that it's it's bigendered or whatever you want to call it, but I don't know that, and that's a pretty interesting thing. But in the new directive, if an employee was to bring a claim alleging that they have been wronged due to the principle of equal pay, the employer would bear the burden of proving that they have no direct or indirect discrimination in relation to pay. That's that seems like over the top, and it seems very frustrating. I imagine as an employer that would be quite frustrating. Quite a few countries within the EU and outside the EU are embracing gender pay gap reporting. This started in 2017 in the United Kingdom for employers with 250 or more employees, but it's continued in Ireland, for example. There's legislation, as well as countries like France or in Belgium that have their own pay reporting mechanisms. Despite all that, the European Union notes that, quote, the pay gap persists. It stood at 13% in 2020 with significant variations across the member states and has decreased only minimally over the last 10 years. The gender pay gap is caused by various factors, such as gender stereotypes, the perpetuation of the glass ceiling, and the, quote, sticky floor. So, despite the innumerable amount of programs in place, ESG, everything that has gone with this, gender based pay discrimination still exists in the mind of the European Union, and the only way to resolve it is by publishing the pay of everyone involved. I think that there is some merit in requesting this. I'm not sure, if everyone's doing it, there's not exactly a competitive advantage or disadvantage to doing this, other than the competitive disadvantage or advantage of countries that don't do it. But I think that's minimal and negligible. In addition, in November of 2022, the European Union Parliament formally adopted a new EU directive on gender balance on corporate boards. Under that directive, large companies have to have at least 40% of their non executive directors, or 33% of all board of directors, be of the underrepresented sex by June 30, 2026. I don't believe that they have the same laws in place for ethnic minorities, which is quite strange. Ethnic minorities within the European Union often have significant struggles and more struggles than in the United States. One of the key important points from Article 6 of this is titled Transparency of Pay Setting and Pay Progression Policy. It says employers shall make easily accessible to their workers the criteria that are used to determine workers' pay, pay levels, and pay progression. Those criteria shall be objective and gender neutral, as we expect. You know, I think that that's very important. I'm curious on how clear you need to be with respect to this because I've worked for hundreds of companies that are quite specific as to what determines pay, pay level, and pay progression. But on the other hand, it doesn't often relate itself into the real world, into real life. I do think that pay progression does give people a kind of a hope for the future, and I encourage employers in the United States to be very transparent about their pay and very objective. Well, let me know what you think down below. Is this going to solve the gender pay gap? Is this going to be the thing that breaks through the gender wall, or is this another legislation that will lead to more bureaucracy but no greater results? Let me know in the comments down below. Like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video. Bye, guys.